Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the fascinating, deeply polarized spectrum of the modern animal advocacy movement. When we look at how society interacts with animals, we tend to lump all advocacy into this one giant bucket of animal lovers. But beneath the surface, there are intense philosophical divides, radically different tactics, and a super rich history that has actually sparked FBI anti-terrorism investigations and birthed entirely new academic disciplines. Let's see just how deep this rabbit hole goes.
So here's a question for you. Do you know the actual difference between animal welfare and animal liberation? It's a genuine question, because while these terms get tossed around interchangeably in everyday conversation, they actually represent fundamentally opposed philosophies about human-animal relations. Think of it like this. Are we trying to make the cages bigger, or are we trying to just empty the cages entirely? That is the core tension we're going to explore today, and the answer to that question completely changes how activists operate out in the real world.
To get to the bottom of this, here is our agenda for today. First, we'll look at welfare, rights, or liberation. Second, the animal liberation front. Third, tactics and terrorism classifications. And finally, critical animal studies.
All right, Part 1, welfare, rights, or liberation?
Let's draw on the analysis of author and attorney Jim Mason to really break down this foundational split. Over on one side, we have the mainstream welfarist goal. Now, welfarists fundamentally accept the age-old human uses of animals, whether we're talking about for food, scientific research, or entertainment. Their main objective is just to minimize suffering within those existing industries. Think of things like the Animal Welfare Act or the Humane Slaughter Act. They might regulate the size of a cage, or the temperature during transport, or the specific method of slaughter. But at the end of the day, the cage and the slaughter remain totally intact. It's all about mitigation. Now, on the complete opposite side, the liberationist demand is total abolition. They argue that humanity is technologically, scientifically, and morally developed enough to just replace animals as resources entirely. To a liberationist, regulating a slaughterhouse is basically like regulating a fundamentally unjust institution. They don't want bigger cages. They literally want no cages at all.
And this brings us to a brilliant quote from Mason that perfectly illustrates where all the public confusion comes from. As he points out, the term animal rights frequently gets utilized as a PR buzzword by both sides of the aisle. People love the word rights, right? We are culturally programmed to view rights favorably as a hallmark of a just society. Liberation, on the other hand, that can conjure up images of militant revolutions and underground resistance. So you end up with liberationists using the word rights to sound a bit more palatable to the mainstream, and you have welfarists using the exact same word to sound more progressive and modern. This creates a wildly confusing middle ground for the public. When you donate to an animal rights charity, you might honestly think you're paying for better welfare and comfortable habitats, when you're actually funding a total liberation campaign trying to shut down industries entirely, or, of course, vice versa. It completely masks that stark contrast between the two camps.
Moving on to Part 2, the Animal Liberation Front.
So, what exactly happens when all this theory leaves the page and actually hits the streets? Just looking at their origins, it's wild to track this rapid, decade-long evolution in the UK, where frustration basically bred militancy. Back in 1964, the Hunt Saboteurs Association formed simply to interrupt ongoing fox hunts. Everyday citizens would blow horns or lay down false scents just to distract the hounds. Harmless enough, right? But by 1972, a much more radical splinter group called the Band of Mercy decided that merely interrupting was ineffective and inherently reactive. They wanted to stop the hunts before they even began, so they started proactively destroying hunting vehicles and equipment. The escalation was swift. By 1974, after serving 12 months in prison for property damage, an activist named Ronnie Lee realized that these isolated groups just weren't enough, so he founded the Animal Liberation Front. In just 10 short years, the movement morphed from everyday citizens holding protest signs into a full-blown underground militant network completely dedicated to direct action and systematic sabotage.
Now, the ALF operates as a completely non-hierarchical, leaderless resistance. Literally anyone can claim to be part of the ALF, as long as they follow some strict guidelines, like being vegan and taking absolutely every precaution not to harm any human or non-human animal during their actions. They actually often compare their covert cell structure to the historical Underground Railroad. But to understand why they take on such immense personal and legal risks, we have to define the core ideology they're fighting against, and that is speciesism. They believe that exploiting animals is based on a totally arbitrary and unjust bias. To a liberationist, speciesism is seen as morally equivalent to racism or sexism. It's the idea that simply being born as a different species automatically makes you a legitimate subject for human exploitation. They see fighting speciesism as the absolute next logical step in the historical progression of civil rights.
And their militant motivations don't just come out of nowhere. They're actually grounded in two very specific philosophical arguments that challenge exactly how we define moral worth. First up is the argument of marginal cases, which basically asserts that there is no clear philosophical dividing line between humans and animals that legitimizes exploitation. Second is the argument of missing relevance. This one argues that even if humans are objectively more intelligent or physically different, those differences don't magically grant us a moral right to exploit. Think of it this way. A liberationist would argue that we don't allow highly intelligent humans to exploit less intelligent humans in a hospital or a workplace. Intelligence doesn't dictate basic rights in human society, right? So they argue we absolutely cannot use intelligence as a free pass to justify exploiting animals. They assert that these qualitative differences just lack moral relevance when it comes to the basic capacity to suffer.
Which brings us to Part 3, Tactics in Terrorism Classifications.
Because the ALF believes that legal campaigns and philosophical debates are just way too slow. They employ some highly controversial methods aimed at inflicting catastrophic economic damage on industries profiting from animals. This kind of action started with the direct release of animals, like the famous 1981 Silver Spring monkeys case in the US, where activists literally broke in and physically removed animals from a research lab. But it escalates to heavy economic sabotage. For instance, over in Germany, the ALF claimed responsibility for arson attacks on massive, newly built poultry facilities. They purposely waited until the buildings were totally finished, but still completely empty of animals, and then set them ablaze, causing tens of thousands of euros in damage. The specific goal? Bankrupt the operators before a single animal could even be placed inside. In the US, tactics have been even more militant, including intense intimidation campaigns where things like Molotov cocktails were left at the private homes of UCLA animal researchers. The logic is brutal, but from their perspective, it's completely clear. Make the business of exploiting animals too expensive and too dangerous to even continue.
As an observer of all this, it's absolutely fascinating to map out the shockwaves these tactics send across society. Law enforcement agencies like the FBI and Homeland Security explicitly label the ALF a domestic terrorist threat because of their use of arson and intimidation. Meanwhile, your mainstream traditional animal welfare groups strongly distance themselves. They argue the ALF completely alienates the public, creates massive enemy images, and basically halts any productive legislative dialogue. And legally speaking, prosecuting a leaderless resistance is an absolute nightmare for the state. Take the Weiner Neustaedter trial in Austria, which is a landmark case that perfectly illustrates this friction. The government tried to use an anti-mafia law to prosecute 13 highly public animal rights activists, accusing them of secretly running the underground ALF criminal enterprise. It became this massive, highly controversial trial that literally gripped the nation. Ultimately, though, all 13 were acquitted because no tangible connection between legal, above-ground public activism and underground ALF sabotage could actually be proven. It highlights exactly how incredibly difficult it is for traditional legal systems to combat these decentralized ideological networks.
And finally, let's look at Part 4, Critical Animal Studies. So, we've seen the underlying philosophy, and we've seen the street-level militant action. But you know, to truly establish a movement with long-term staying power, you need intellectual infrastructure. Founded in 2001 by scholars Stephen Best and Anthony J. Nocella, Critical Animal Studies, or CAS, is fundamentally different from traditional animal studies. Traditional animal studies observe the human-animal relationship somewhat neutrally, just documenting behaviors or societal trends. CAS, however, is a radical subdiscipline that unapologetically integrates academic research with direct political action and a demand for total animal liberation. This is literally where the ivory tower meets the picket line.
CAS actually formalizes this liberation philosophy into a specific academic framework. They operate on 10 core principles, focusing heavily on intersectionality. They treat the exploitation of animals not as an isolated issue, but as a symptom of a much broader capitalist system that also oppresses marginalized human groups through racism and sexism. They demand total liberation for humans, animals, and the earth simultaneously. But here is perhaps the most controversial part. For any academic field, CAS strictly rejects the whole idea of objective neutrality. In traditional academia, you're supposed to be an impartial observer, completely removed from the subject you're studying. In CAS, they believe theory absolutely must lead to practice. They openly support radical politics, anti-capitalist restructuring, and even the very economic sabotage tactics we just discussed with the ALF. It completely blurs the line between being a university researcher and a political revolutionary.
We've covered an incredibly vast spectrum in this explainer today. From peaceful welfare legislation pushing for slightly larger cages, to underground arson attempting to bankrupt industries, all the way over to academic frameworks demanding total systemic dismantling. As the philosophical boundary between humans and animals continues to blur, it leaves us with one massive critical question. How will our society, which is, let's face it, entirely economically dependent on animal use for food, medicine, and clothing, handle this escalating friction? What happens when the immovable demand for total liberation collides irreversibly with our everyday systems? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. I'll leave you to think on that.